It's a great pleasure to introduce somebody who needs no introduction to this group. The best storyteller, someone said a professional liar, Bill Brown.
Thank you. My eyes have gone bad in the service of my country. Remember that quote? Send me a test. We'll talk a little bit. Just a second. Put my church voice on. I'm used to having my speaking voice on where I don't really need a microphone. But we'll talk a little bit about probably one of the most unknown events that took place in Burke County in 1776, the Battle of the Fort. A little bit to start with some definitions. When we talk about Burke County, obviously in 1776, this was Rowan County. And where the Battle of the Fort took place was in McDowell County. Of course, McDowell County wasn't formed until 1843. So we're going to say Burke County to cover basically the area from Quaker Meadows all the way up to Old Fort. We'll call that Burke County. That's the simplest, easiest way to get it done, so we don't go back to Rowan. Still up there. So when I say Burke County, that's what I'm talking about, although we are talking about present day McDowell and present day Burke. I say Rowan being Burke being formed in 77. First thing we need to do is talk a little bit about some background. Kind of give you an idea of what was going on at this time. Got the proclamation of 1763, the Treaty of the Sycamore Shoals in 1775. We'll talk a little bit about frontier forts and some definitions with those. And then the conditions in the Quaker Meadows and Pleasant Gardens area from the fall of 75 to the summer of 76. I can't believe this thing's actually working. Proclamation 1763, at the close of the French and Indian War, that set the boundary lines of the settlements between the whites and the Indians, or the Native Americans. And that was designed primarily to keep those two groups from interacting. It was a good idea at the time. It sounded like it never did really catch on good. But that line was set basically the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountain. That's where the Eastern Continental Divide is a good general idea for that proclamation line ran through. Treaty of Sycamore Shoals happened in 1775. Richard Henderson, who was from Granville County, North Carolina, was an influential person, a judge, and fairly well-to-do person. He came up with a scheme, and some of his buddies did, to purchase land from the Cherokee. Now, remember the proclamation of 1775 said all that land across the Blue Ridge belonged to the Native Americans. Well, if it belonged to them, he rationalized, why can't I buy it? That's not the same as going over there and settling. Pretty good idea he had. And it was generally agreed upon by all parties. Tonawasta, one of the principal chiefs of the Cherokee, an older chief, was very much in favor of it. However, Dragon Canoe, which was the younger one of the principal chiefs, he was bitterly opposed to it. And that's really where the trouble starts to come in. But Henderson did manage to purchase practically all of what's present-day Kentucky and most of what's present-day Tennessee in that one treaty of the Sycamore Shoals in 1775. A little bit about frontier forts. You'll hear forts, stations, and blockhouses. Those are the three terms you'll hear, and when you read the old fiction files, that's what you'll come up with. Little explanation. Fort and station, those names are interchangeable. Now word fort, you're thinking about what comes to mind is something military installation or something like that. And that's not what we're looking at here in the back country on the frontier. These weren't military per se fortifications. They were put up usually by the people in the area as a place of refuge in time of trouble or attacks. It could be usually, but not always, it was a palisaded wall, logs stuck up around a centralized blockhouse or a cabin or several cabins. But again, it's important to remember the word fort and station are interchangeable. They both mean the same thing and used in the same context. Blockhouses, when you hear a blockhouse is typically a standalone structure with upper stories overhanging. Usually a two-story structure, that second story overhanging, so you could actually shoot down on somebody. Somebody couldn't come up, climb the wall, and get to you. The weakest part, of course, being the roof. A little bit about the conditions along the Quake Meadows and Pleasant Gardens area in the fall of 75 to summer of 76. It was usually in the 75, it was pretty well peaceful. There wasn't much going on. There hadn't been any real trouble since the close of the French and Indian War in 1763. The Cherokees stayed on their side. Settlers pretty much stayed on their side. There was some crossing, a little bit of hostilities, but nothing really to speak of. It was relatively peaceful in 75. But as we get further into 76, particularly after Henderson's land deal and all the influx moving into across the mountains, that's when you start getting the constant threat of attacks. Again, that was driven up by primarily Jacob Canoe and his followers. You start to see some forts being built up along the frontier. You see spies patrol the area. And the word spies, that's not 007 stuff. That's the spy in the 18th century is a scout who goes out and checks for Indian sign. Typically what they would do, you would have a frontier fort, and you'd have one set of your spies or your scouts would make a 3-mile loop, about 3 miles out to make a loop. And then have another set that would go out about 5 miles and make a loop. And they were always cutting sign, looking for what was going on, checking any kind of activity coming in. Those forts tended to be about 15 to 20 miles apart. That means if you were on the fringe of that area at 10 miles, you could get to a fort. You could go to another 10 miles and get another fort. So about every 15, 20 miles is where you can see those forts built up. Things started getting really bad, and McDowell calls out the militia, and of course it was the Western Rohan, Burke County militia, we'll call it. A good quote from one of the pension files, James McDaniel stated, volunteered and entered the service of the United States on or about the first day of June, 1776, and was ordered by Major Daniel McKesson and Colonel Charles McDowell to march to Davison's Fort on the Catawba River that was stationed at said fort as a guard to keep the Indians off the frontiers and had been stationed scouting and spying. And you see a lot of those pictures reporting the same thing. And they all start about June, because that's when that major threat was really becoming apparent. And like I said, McDowell called out the militia to guard those areas. They built forts along the areas. As they were going out after this call came out, and they realized that there really was a severe danger, they started repairing some of the older places that were there, added some new places. Josiah Brandon, in his Revolutionary War pension, gives an account of building a fort. So we marched to the frontiers and built a fort for protection of that part of North Carolina. The fort is in the limits of what is now Burke County, North Carolina. We then called the place Fort Royal. Now now known in North Carolina by the name Old Fort. So that's something to write down. The original fort up there, Davidson Station, the Davidson's Fort, when it was built, they called it Fort Royal. Why? I'm not sure. I know the Royal Gorge runs up through there. If some of us old enough to remember when US 70 was not I-40. It was not US 70, but old 70, old number 10, ran up the mountain. That gorge is called the Royal Gorge. Was Royal a family that lived there? I don't know, but the name of it was Fort Royal. Or at least according by someone who was actually there at the time. And I always like to refer back to those first-person primary sources. Jacob Ryder, who, by the way, is my fourth great-grandfather, one of my fourth great-grandfathers, gives another account of building the fort. So the Indians broke out in the frontier part of Burke County, in which settlement my father was living at the time, who were thinly settled and men and soldiers were scarce. They committed several murders and robberies. There was a general call for men. A fort was immediately built, and the people of all ages and classes were called into it for their safety. That, again, is talking about the immediate need. They threw something up. And you can see the picture of people you may recognize one or two in there actually working on building a fort. Hostilities began to erupt. Best recording of that comes from Griffith Rutherford on July the 14th, 1776. And Rutherford was a very educated person. He had a good background in his education. He was well respected. He was the commander of the entire Rowan County militia. I love the way he spells. He spells almost as bad as I do. As an honorable gentleman, I am under the necessity of sending you by express the alarming condition this country is in. The Indians is making great progress in destroying and murdering. In the frontiers of this county, 37, I am informed, was killed last Wednesday and Thursday on the Catawba River. He's talking about right here from Quaker Meadows on up through Pleasant Gardens towards Old Fort in that section. July the 14th, when he wrote that, that's one way you can track back and confirm a date that another picture said when the Battle of Fort was. But you remember that date, you can look back on a 1776 calendar and you can see what days they're talking about. Davidson's Fort was attacked. Joseph Peters gave an account. He marched as an Indian spy to Samuel Davidson's Fort on the fork of the Catawba River. He was stationed at said fort until July ensuing, when a body of Indians drove the spies from said fort. They then retreated to Kathy's Fort. So we now had men stationed at Davidson's Fort, at Kathy's Fort, and here at Quaker Meadows Fort, on that whole string, and each one of those is about 15 to 20 miles apart. But according to Peters, they were overwhelmed with Davidson's, and they drew back to Kathy's, which Kathy's Fort is about where Marion is right now. I'll have them back here in a minute. But as they retreated back, they picked up settlers along the way, so their party got larger and larger and larger as they moved on down the river, trying to get to safety. And again, they retreated, like I said, to Kathy's Fort, picking up people along the way. Moses Stepp, in his pension file, says his colonel was Charles McDowell. Captain Winston and Captain White went to the head of the Catawba to extricate the women and children who were hemmed up by the Indians. Until that body of people were moving on down the river, trying to get back here to Quaker Meadows. Locations of the fort. For this sort of one particular reason, so I use this accordingly. The number one, the Davison's Fort, Old Fort. And this, by the way, this map is a 1905 version, so you don't have Lake James to interfere with how things were laid out. Come on down to number two, which is Kathy's Fort. And to the best of my knowledge, Kathy's Fort, to the best of my research, says Kathy's Fort is in the relative vicinity of where 221 and Highway 70 come together outside Marion. If you go out, I know y'all from McDowell County, you know what I'm talking about. When you go out Hankins Road, you go out Hankins Road about a mile, and that's about where Kathy's Fort was. The battle actually took place here with the confluence of the North Fork, the Catawba, and the Catawba River come together. And then, of course, McDowell's Station, or the Quaker Meadows Fort, is the proper term, is number 4 over there. There was a minor fort that I had seen reference to. My fingers made a mess. That made reference to was the Muddy Creek Fort, but I haven't been able to find where that was. And I don't know why they weren't trying to make it to the Muddy Creek Fort, unless they just got so overwhelmed that they wanted to get as far and fast as they could. And that's the same places on the modern map, so you might be able to pick up a little bit better references to where everything is. Cherokee lay an ambush at the confluence of the North Fork and the Catawba River. James McDaniel in his pension says, the first engagement they met with the Indians who lay an ambush at the North Fork and the Catawba River. I don't have a good number on how many were there, but another pension will give an idea of the killed and wounded. But the Indians knew they were coming. If you've ever been up that area, there's a section there just above where the lake covers that confluence now. But it's about where Burnett's Landing is, where the old river, old Catawba, and the old North Fork came together. When the water's really low, you can almost pick out how they come down through there. You go a little bit up the North Fork there, just above where the mouth was, and it narrows down pretty narrow. And that would make an ideal place for that attack to have occurred. Joseph Ford gives an account. So at the crossing of the North Fork of Catawba, we were met by a considerable number of Indian warriors belonging to the Cherokee Nation and had an engagement with them. But he actually says they were crossing the North Fork, which that would coincide with where I'm thinking that area would be. And if you go on out Hankins Road, I think it turns into Lake James Road at some point through there. And once you go down to the lake on Hankins, it picks up, the road comes in, and the rest of the way out, I believe, is called Lake James Road. But where it crosses the North Fork, it'd be a perfect place for an ambush. The sides start to be a little steep, and most likely that's where they crossed it. They went to the actual mouth of the North Fork where it emptied into the Catawba, which would be much wider there. So you go upriver a little bit, and that's where the old road ran, was through that area too. Jacob Driver gives another account of the battle. He said, we collected all the families that were there, and on our way to the fort, we were attacked by the Indians, and a warm engagement ensued. The Indians fled. We know not what they suffered. We lost a few of our men, and our captain got badly wounded, but he recovered. Now, Winston was the captain that Driver was serving under. Joseph Ford gives another account. So at the crossing of the North Fork of the Catawba River, we were met by a considerable number of Indian warriors belonging to the Cherokee Nation and had an engagement with them. Crabtree goes on to say, we killed 14 Indians dead on the ground. Crabtree didn't mix words. His pension read like that the whole way. But according to him, they killed at least 14. Isaac Thompson gives another account. Captain Reuben White, who had commanded some of the forts, marched with his party and met the Indians at the mouth of the North Fork of the Catawba, and there fought the Battle of the Fork, as it is called, and where he bravely fell fighting. So we know that Reuben White died. Reuben White lived on Johns River here in present-day Burke County. Martha McFalls gives a fairly good account. Said the Whites lost 2 men killed, Captain Reuben White and Sage Shelton, a private, and wounded Captain Thomas Weston. The Indians lost 8 killed, the number wounded not known. Joseph Porter goes on, Zebulon Shelton and Sage Shelton are probably the same person. Should be Zabe instead of Save. Zebulon Shelton, a private, was killed, and 7 or 8 of our troops wounded, among whom were Captains White and Winston. White afterwards died of his wounds, and Winston recovered. I know this thing's telling me to sign into something here. That's what I don't like. Jonathan McPeters gives the date of the Battle of the Fork in his pension file. The next tour of service was the Upper Fork on the Catawba, where we were stationed for some time as a ranging company under Captain Reuben White, who was killed in the Battle of the Fork the 11th of July, 1776. Colonel Carson acted as ensign. That's John Carson from the Carson House site. They tied the date down to the 11th. If you take Rutherford's letter that's dated the 14th, and he talks about last Wednesday, last Tuesday, whatever it was, you look at the calendar, you backtrack, you can track where they left Davidson's. The next day, when they attacked, and it comes out to the 11th. So Peters was correct in his remembrance, matching that up with a contemporary letter. And I always like to do that when I'm working with pension files. Because you got to remember, the pension files, these folks are filling these out 50 or so years after the event. Most of them are in their 80s. And you can't just take one pension file and read that and decide, well, this is exactly what happened. You've got to take 2 or 3 and combine and read them all together. Sometimes the guys will be off by a year or 2. But if you have something like Rutherford's letter that was written at the time, you know when it was. So his letter, written at the time, and Peter's pension account, which was 50 years after the fact, the dates coincide. So we know that Peters was correct on saying the 11th of July. James McDaniel says the company consisted of 82 men. Joseph Ford's account, we were met by a considerable number of Indian warriors belonging to the Cherokee Nation. So they still don't really have a good handle on how many Indians there were. The 82 men, that coincided with what McDowell called out. Now, did all 82 men go towards Davidson's and then come back? Most likely he had spread those out. So there may have been 82 by the time they got to the fork. But it certainly wasn't 82 all the way starting from Davidson's back. But 82 men were in that company, and again, that can be backed up by some primary source documentation or contemporaneous documentation through accounts. After the battle was over, it was a relatively short battle they had. After the battle was over, Bigfield Wood in his pension file said we marched to the Quaker Meadow Fort, stationed at said fort until reinforced by General Rutherford's army. Jacob Driver again says, as soon as our fight was over, we hurried on with our little charge. So they continued to make haste to get here to Quaker Meadows. Quaker Meadows being under siege, General Rutherford again reported to the Rowan County Committee of Safety. I'm also informed that Colonel McDowell, 10 men more, and 120 women and children is besieged in some kind of a fort. Indians around them, no help to them before yesterday. And they were surrounded on Wednesday. I expect next account to hear that they are all destroyed. And again, when he wrote that, you go back and look at, that was part of the 14th of July writing. So if you go back and look at Wednesday, you'll find that is about the time that the men who were retreating back from Davison's, who spent the night at Kathy's, were in the battle. That's about the time they reached McDowell Station here in Quaker Medicine. Like I said, those dates all line up on the calendar. Quaker Medicine Fort was relieved by Rutherford's militia, but Peters stated that was stationed at Quaker Medicine Fort until reinforced by Rutherford's army. Crabtree reports General Rutherford shortly after this engagement came on with his brigade. Now, I got to tell you a little bit about that picture there. I like that picture. We had, this was taken at Martin Station up in Virginia, where I volunteered. Been volunteering up there for almost 30 years now. But we had a siege, what we call first person living history event, where we actually locked ourselves inside the fort. We had folks who were doing the Native American reenactment. Actors surrounded us, and we were locked up in there for like 3 days. Hardly any sleep at all. But after we were relieved, this guy here is known as Captain Titus. And he always liked to pass a jug around at the end of our program or whatever. We don't reenact drinking. But in that jug was the absolute worst tasting, I don't know what it was. He called it rum. Now, I drink a lot of rum, and I like rum. I don't like it because I like it because it's historically accurate. That's what I say. I drunk a lot of rum, and whatever that was, yeah. It made you want to go out and pick up some horse manure and chew on it to get the taste out of your mouth. That's how bad it was. But that was typical of what went on after relief of the fort. There's some good documentation from Lenore's journal where he talks about on the way back from the Cherokee campaign, which was a follow-up to all this. On the way back, Benjamin Cleveland treated his men to like 4 gallons of brandy and 3 gallons of whiskey. But you can see that all the time. After an engagement's over, the commanders usually treat the militia with a drink or two. But after the Battle of the Fort, there was a coordinated war against the Cherokee, coordinated between South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. In North Carolina, it was called Rutherford's Cherokee Expedition, but that was all part of that big push to effectively take the Cherokee out of the rest of the war. Now, the Cherokee were enticed by the British to attack along the frontiers. The idea being to tie the militia down on the frontiers while the British were planning an invasion in North Carolina, in Wilmington area. And the Scotch Tories were notorious for being loyalists. They were going to rise up and basically split the state. They got out of sync a little bit. The Scotch Tories rose early. We sent militia from Burke County down there. They whooped them, came back. The Cherokee were a little late in their attacks, and so we had all our forces here. So the British master plan didn't really play out. The Cherokee got the bad end of the stick. South Carolina was probably the most brutal on the Cherokee. Under Colonel Andrew Williamson, they burned 31 of the lower Cherokee towns. So when I say burned, they burned them to the ground. And not only did they burn them to the ground, they took their corn crop, they destroyed that. If they could burn it, they did. If they couldn't, they turned the livestock out in it. And if that wasn't good enough, they just stomped it down. Their corn, pumpkins, squash, everything. It was really, really brutal what happened to the Cherokee. Virginia, under Colonel William Christian, burned 6 of the Overhill towns, and Rutherford with North Carolina burned 11 of the Midland Valley towns. So they pretty much decimated the Cherokee. Benfield Wood sums up the whole thing. Martin, and he's talking about as after the Battle of the Fork, after the relief from McDowell Station in September, Rutherford mustered his men here. You think Kings Mountain was a big mustering grounds? They had 1,400 pack horses mustered in Pleasant Gardens. 1,400 pack horses, not counting about 2,400 foot troops that went across the mountains. But this is what he was talking about. It said, marched through the Cherokee Nation, marched by the Watauga towns on the Tennessee River, burnt said town, and thence to the Coley towns, burnt them, and marched to the Valley towns on Tellico, and burnt same, took some prisoners at Big Tellico. They pretty much decimated the Cherokee. And all that was the timeline of the Battle of the Fork. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Dragon Canoe after the battle and all, you know, he went over, I guess, Kentucky, took some of the Cherokee with him.
They had some interactions there, but I think he eventually fled into, I won't say Alabama.
Did he?
I'm pretty sure it was Alabama. That's where he ended up eventually. Yes, sir.
Has it been established pretty close as to where McDowell Station or the McDowell Fort was located here?
My best guess, based on what pension files have said, based on the logistics of the area, the distance from one fort to the next that we know of, where the roads used to be, I think it was where, in the center there on 126, where 126 crosses Canoe Creek, there at Oakville Park and Forest. Those bottom areas that do that. That makes the most logical sense. That property there up on top of the hill, in what's now the park, was where Willow Hill was, and that was the home of James Murphy. Prior to that, that was Hugh McDowell who lived there. Hugh McDowell, of course, being Charles McDowell's older brother. And for a number of years after that, after Hugh McDowell died in 1772, I believe, his wife lived there, which was known as the Widow Jane McDowell Place. And then, of course, Murphy married Hugh McDowell and Jane McDowell's daughter, and that's how he ended up with the property. And then later on, they were the Avery family, they intermarried with the Averys and the Avery family. Averys intermarried with the Harbison family, and most people know that place is called Harbison Place. But initially, it was McDowell's. So that would go back as part of the McDowell property, the greater McDowell property. And Quaker Meadows, of course, extended further than what we give it credit for now. It's kind of like Pleasant Gardens of the McDowell. It was a bigger area than where PT School is now. Yes, sir.
One thing that I touched on last month, and I've read something about it again since last month, was the skepticism that the government pension office showed towards this frontier service. Do you have any sense of what the success rate was for these pension applications that came in from militiamen who were doing service in the forts and on the frontier?
If they could prove their service, and it had to be, I won't say off the top of my head, it had to have 6 months of service. Now, that's not 6 continuous months, but had to total at least 6 months of service. I've seen more accepted pensions than rejected pensions. Rejected pension doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't serve. It just meant either one, he didn't have the required service, or two, he couldn't prove the service. You'd be surprised how many people still had their discharges. How many people, I say 50 years later, a lot of the contemporaries of those guys had passed on. But they did find people who would come and swear or send out affidavits, yes, I served with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. So they were accepted if they could make the proof that they did. I know a lot of the folks in the Virginia area tried to claim Dunmore's War in 1774 as service against the Shawnee along the Ohio and Kanawha rivers. But seeing that was prior to 1775, that didn't count. No matter how much service they had, that was not countable service. Yes, sir.
Bill, from what I've seen in pension applications, the reason that they're rejected are either that the person didn't serve the required number of months, 6 months, or in many cases, it was a widow's pension and she couldn't prove she was married to him. And again, that didn't, they were not marriage certificates. There sometimes were marriage records, but often it was just some person of reputation in the community who would sign an affidavit saying, yes, I know that Jim and Joan were married. But I can't think of very many pension applications that were rejected for lack of proving service. I've seen a few, but as Bill said, you have to remember, it's 50 years later, you have to be destitute to apply for it.
The early pensions you did.
Yeah.
The
The later-
1836 Act did away with the destitute part.
Right, but 1836, think about it. That's 60 years. So if you were 20 in 1776, you're now 80. So in a lot of cases, the pensions were approved with very, very slim evidence. More likely to be approved than disapproved. I would also make the point that for SAR purposes, the one battle of Lord Dunmore's War is acceptable. One battle.
That's
That's
not
all.
for a pension.
But not for a pension from the federal government.
It was a pension, yeah.
So if you're worried about your pension, you can't get it. But we actually have a member, Al Ernest, who got in because of Lord Dunmore's War.
Well, I thank you very much for your time.